April 7, 1241. Dawn. Just as the mist peeled off the Silesian plain and the bells of Lanika had barely finished tolling. Listen, the sound of polished steel rubbing against itself, the low thunder of armored horses, the hot metal smell of breath and leather. That is the sound of Europe's finest marching to what they believed would be a holy victory. They called it duty, they called it salvation, they called it honor. They did not call it annihilation. Banners snapping like thunderclaps, the black cross of the Teutonic Knights, the red cross of the Templars, the white eagle of Poland. A parade of faith and metal stretching for miles. Men who had been taught since childhood that God rode at their right flank. Men who polished helmets until their reflections stared back with confidence. Men who had never had to fear an enemy that refused the rules. Against them, like a shadow folding itself into the world, came a different order of war. Not brutality without method, but a machine of discipline and cunning, honed by Genghis Khan's bloodline. Speed, deception, logistics, an army that thought like a storm. This is not a battle of steel against steel. It is a collision between two worldviews. The European knight is a tank of flesh and pride, heavy, glorified, magnificent. The Mongol is a surgeon of movement, light, invisible at distances, precise. The knights could only imagine enemies who charged back. They could not imagine an enemy so patient they turned the sky into a weapon. Imagine arrows, not merely dozens, but a million cold humming counters to chivalric glory, arcing like a meteor shower and finding the tender seams of mail and the soft throats of destriers. Imagine every horse that falls changing the geometry of the field, making cavalry useless, turning honor into weight. On that first day, the Mongols did not rush. They choreographed humiliation. Wave after wave of horse archers rode in to be seen, close enough to draw hatred, too far to be reached. They sang the knights' anger like bait. The knights wanted contact. They wanted the romance of the charge. They wanted a story. The Mongols offered them a different narrative. Patient attrition, the slow grinding of hope into a fine, bitter ash. The mental toll was as lethal as any spear. Men who had been heroes in crusades found themselves pinned as targets, stripped of the ritual that gave their suffering meaning. By dusk, the field smelled of blood and horseflesh. Hundreds lay broken, not by the glorious clash of lances, but by a quiet arithmetic of distance and motion. The Mongols pulled back, their fires far off on the horizon. The night filled with drums and muffled laughter. That night, something else happened to Europe. Not a loss of men alone, but a rupture of belief. The image of invincibility, of chivalric dominance, had been punctured. You feel that puncture now, as if the world inhaled and found itself changed. April 1241. Before sunrise on the second day, the plains of Silesia were wrapped in a cold mist, the kind that clings to the skin like a warning. The survivors of the first day stood in silence, listening to the faint echoes of Mongol war drums drifting across the darkness. Some men prayed. Others simply stared into the fog, unable to sleep, replaying the same nightmare. Arrows falling from the sky like black rain. Horses screaming as if the earth itself had split open beneath them. Duke Henry walked through the camp, torch in hand, looking into the eyes of his men. He saw fear, but also something else, the quiet resolve of men who understood that history was watching, that if they broke here, Europe would break with them. Henry paused beside the wounded, men lying on blood-soaked blankets, faces pale, armor punctured, bodies shivering from fever. A Templar knight, his helmet split by an arrow that had grazed his skull, grabbed Henry's wrist with surprising strength. "My lord, they do not fight as men. They see everything." Henry gave the only answer he could. But the Mongols had already anticipated everything, and they were already tightening the noose. Beyond the tree line, invisible in the fog, Mongol scouts, each one trained from childhood to ride silently, to breathe silently,
watched every shift of the European camp. They measured the distances between tents, counted the wounded, noted which units appeared strongest, which were wavering. Mongol warfare was not brutality for its own sake. It was mathematics, psychology, precision. And the Europeans had never faced an enemy who treated war as a science. At sunrise, Bar and Kadan rode along their own lines, saying nothing. Their men didn't need speeches. Every warrior already knew his exact role, his exact moment to act, who he would follow, who he would kill. To the Mongols, war was choreography, deadly, beautiful, efficient. When the harassment began again that morning, many Europeans thought it was the same tactic as yesterday. But this time, the rhythm was different. The Mongols fired fewer arrows. Their retreat was slower, almost clumsy. A performance crafted for one audience, desperate European commanders searching for hope. And Duke Henry fell for it. He had to. The morale of Christendom depended on action. When Meshko led the Polish cavalry into that doomed pursuit, the men believed God was guiding them. But God was not out there on that misty plain. Only Mongols, only silence, only the tightening trap. When the trap finally snapped shut, when the Polish cavalry vanished into the rising dust like men sinking beneath a tide, the fate of Europe shifted in a single heartbeat. When the dust settled enough for shapes to reappear, the truth revealed itself like a blade sliding out of a scabbard. The Polish vanguard, Meshko's proud cavalry, was gone. Not defeated, not scattered, erased, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. At first, the Europeans did not understand what they were seeing.
There were only bodies. Horses piled in unnatural angles, arrows sticking out of armor like porcupine quills. And the silence, an awful silence, broken only by the distant rhythm of Mongol hooves circling back into the mist, unseen but undeniably present. Duke Henry's jaw trembled, though he forced himself to remain still. His commanders around him argued, some urging retreat, others demanding a countercharge. Fear warred against pride, pride warred against reason, and reason had already died with the first wave. Then the Mongol horns blew. Not loud, not dramatic. 3 short blasts, flat, emotionless. But those 3 notes carried a message more terrifying than any shout. It has begun. From the east, west, and south, the Mongol wings began to fold inward like the jaws of a predator. Not rushing, not charging, closing, shrinking the world. The Europeans felt their space compressing, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. Knights who had never tasted fear began losing breath inside their helmets. Horses stomped nervously. Priests clutched their crosses with white knuckles. Then came the arrows. Not in great waves now, but in thin, precise sheets. Every volley was a surgeon's cut. Every arrow found a seam, a gap, a weakness. Each thud of impact was followed by a grunt, a scream, or the heavy collapse of armored flesh hitting mud. Henry ordered an advance, shouting over the chaos. The infantry surged forward, shields up, forming a protective shell. But the Mongols had engineered this moment with brutal elegance. As Henry's infantry tightened their formation, Mongol cavalry hit them from the flanks. Not to break the line, but to slow it, disrupt it, make it heavy. Heavy meant predictable. Predictable meant dead. And then, without warning, the forest behind Henry exploded with movement. A cloud of Mongol horsemen, previously hidden, perfectly silent, perfectly still, burst out with thunderous speed. Their timing was flawless, their direction devastating. They struck the European rear like a hammer slamming into glass. In that instant, Henry realized the truth. They had never been fighting a battle. They had been walking into choreography, into geometry, into a design crafted by minds who had spent generations perfecting the art of killing nations. Europe was no longer fighting to win. Europe was fighting not to vanish.
The desert wind shifted that night, slow, deliberate, like a beast inhaling before the kill. The Romans felt it first, not through sight, but through instinct. A silence had fallen over the hills of Alasia, a silence so unnatural that even the camp dogs stopped growling and pressed their ears flat to the ground. Because something was coming. Not the Gauls inside Alasia, not the starving garrison Caesar had trapped like caged wolves. No, this was the other threat. The one Caesar had always knew would arrive, but prayed he could crush before it fully awakened. The relief army of Gaul.
From the ridge beyond the Roman outer wall, torches flared, 1, then 10, then hundreds, until the horizon looked as though a chain of volcanoes had erupted in the dark. Tens of thousands of Gauls, drawn from dozens of tribes, had marched to break Caesar's siege. Their banners snapped like thunder in the wind. Their war horns moaned through the valley like the call of ancient spirits. And the Romans were surrounded. Inside the walls, a starving enemy ready to burst out. Outside the walls, a fresh army ready to crush them inward. And in the middle, Caesar and his legions, trapped in a tightening vice of death. This was the moment any other commander would have prayed to escape. But Caesar did not pray. He planned. Even before the relief army arrived, he had ordered a second wall, the circumvallation, a monstrous ring of fortifications facing outward. Ditches, towers, traps, earthworks, an entire defensive city built in mere days. His men cursed him. Some whispered he had lost his mind. Others believed he was building his own tomb. But now, the genius of the madman became clear. 2 walls, 2 enemies, 1 Roman army. Alasia wasn't a siege. It was a death arena, engineered by a man who refused to surrender, refused to retreat, and refused to accept the possibility that fate could ever turn against him. As the Gauls gathered under the torchlit sky, the Roman horns answered back, long, deep, resonant notes rolling across the valley like the heartbeat of an awakening titan. The trap was closing, not on Caesar, on Gaul itself. And before sunrise, the soil of Alasia would drink more blood than any battlefield Julius Caesar had ever touched. Before dawn, Alasia held its breath. The sky was still black, the earth still frozen, but the tension, the crushing electric tension, was already tearing at the nerves of every soldier trapped between Caesar's double walls. Roman sentries stood rigid on their towers, knuckles white around their spears. The only sound was the low groan of wood as the wind pushed against the fortifications. Then, a single Gallic horn shattered the darkness, a sound ancient, primal, like a god screaming. From the hills, the relief army charged. Tens of thousands of warriors sprinted toward the Roman outer wall, their footsteps turning the ground into a tremor. It felt as though the entire plain was alive, shaking, roaring, rising against the few thousand men defending it. But at that very moment, almost perfectly timed, another sound erupted. From inside Alasia, the garrison, starving, desperate, half-mad with hopelessness, surged out of the inner gate with a howl so feral it chilled even the Roman veterans. They weren't fighting for victory. They were fighting to avoid dying like trapped animals. 2 tidal waves of fury, one crashing inward, one exploding outward. And between them, Caesar's army, caught in the jaws of hell. Some Romans fought with the outside enemy. Others spun around to hold back the garrison. Entire cohorts pivoted back and forth, their shields dripping blood from both directions. Orders became screams. Formations buckled. Men slipped in mud slick with blood and frost. And yet, the Roman line did not break. Why? Because Caesar had built this battlefield like a machine. Every ditch, every palisade, every hidden trap forced the Gauls to slow. Some fell into pits lined with sharpened stakes. Others were shredded by iron hooks buried beneath the soil. The Gauls, in their fury, pushed forward blindly and were swallowed by the horrors engineered in Roman dirt.
Still, they kept coming. The relief army hammered the outer wall again and again, arrows clawing at Roman shields like swarms of insects. Towers shook, ramparts splintered. On the opposite side, the defenders inside Alesia screamed as they hurled themselves against the inner wall. Caesar's men were bleeding from both sides, exhausted, barely holding on. Every officer knew the truth. If even one section of the double wall collapsed, if even one cohort broke in fear, if even one mistake was made, the entire Roman army would be buried alive, and Julius Caesar would die at Alesia. By mid-morning, April 9th, 1241, or, in another time, by the final hours of Alesia, the battlefield had become something unrecognizable. Not a plain, not a city, not a wall. A machine of terror, precision, and inevitability. Blood slicked the earth. Smoke rose in choking curls. The air carried the metallic tang of death and the iron taste of despair. On the Silesian plain, Henry's army was gone. His knights, the pride of Europe, reduced to broken corpses and fleeing shadows. On the plains of Gaul, the relief army faltered. Their fury had collided with Roman ingenuity and discipline, and now they reeled under an invisible hand, a hand that had been sculpted by Caesar's mind, tested by countless battles, perfected in secrecy. But history remembers not just the dead, but the lesson carved into the soul of civilization. In 3 days, Mongols had shattered the myth of European invincibility. In one decisive moment at Alesia, Caesar had shown that even overwhelming numbers, even raw fury, could be corralled, managed, and destroyed by strategy, patience, and vision. Imagine the terror, the cognitive dissonance of men who believed in glory, in honor, in God's protection, only to find the world rearranged by calculation, innovation, and merciless logic. Europe, like Rome at Alesia, had been forced to stare at its own limits, to understand that valor alone was insufficient, that even centuries of tradition could be erased by superior thinking and ruthless execution. The aftermath was staggering. At Lenica, 25,000 men were gone in 3 days. At Alesia, Caesar held victory not just with swords, but with geometry, psychology, and anticipation. The battlefield itself was a teacher. Who moved too fast was trapped. Who hesitated was slaughtered. Who overvalued pride was destroyed.
Armies adapted, civilizations evolved, technology advanced, all because someone had been willing to think differently, to break the rules, to confront fear with logic. And yet, in both histories, the Mongols in Poland, Caesar and Gaul, we see the same dark truth. The battlefield is more than men and horses. It is a mirror of the human mind. The one who understands chaos, anticipates fear, and manipulates the perception of reality will not just win a battle, they will reshape history itself. Today, the plains of Silesia and the hills of Alesia are quiet. Grass grows over the bones. Birds wheel lazily in the sky. Yet, if you listen closely, you can hear the faint echo of hooves, the ghostly thunder of steel, the whisper of strategies that changed empires. 3 days. 3 days that rewrote the rules of war. 3 days that forced the world to recognize the terrifying power of the mind over muscle, of calculation over courage, of discipline over instinct. History teaches, history warns, history whispers. Adapt or perish. One misstep and the earth will claim you. The echoes remain, and in them we still hear the lesson of terror, mastery, and inevitability.